Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. With our break from poetry on Fridays this series, as we go back to Fandom Fridays, I'm glad to be able to bring in poetry here on Thursdays, as I read through and discuss the poetry in The Lord of the Rings. So far this series, we've read the various versions of The Road Goes Ever On and the other walking song, Upon the Hearth the Fire is Red. Though most of us know the third verse of that song better after Billy Boyd's musical performance of it, playing Pippin in The Return of the King. Today we're still in the Shire, but as I hinted at yesterday, we're going to be looking at an Elvish song. No, not an Elvis song. But, as always, a little context helps. The singing drew nearer. One clear voice rose now above the others. It was singing in the fair elven tongue, of which Frodo knew only a little, and the others knew nothing. Yet the sound, blending with the melody, seemed to shape itself in their thought into words which they only partly understood. This was the song as Frodo heard it. Snow White, O Lady clear, O Queen beyond the western seas, O light to us that wander here amid the world of woven trees. Gilthoniel, O Elbereth, clear are thy eyes and bright thy breath. Snow White, we sing to thee in a far land beyond the sea. O stars that in the sunless year with shining hand by her were sown, in windy fields now bright and clear we see your silver blossom blown. O Elbereth, Gilthoniel, we still remember, we who dwell in this far land beneath the trees, thy starlight on the western seas. The song ended. These are high elves. They spoke the name of Elbereth, said Frodo in amazement. Few of that fairest folk are ever seen in the Shire. Not many now remain in Middle-earth, east of the great sea. This is indeed a strange chance. The hobbits sat in shadow by the wayside. Before long, the elves came down the lane towards the valley. They passed slowly, and the hobbits could see the starlight glimmering on their hair and in their eyes. They bore no lights, yet as they walked, a shimmer, like the light of the moon above the rim of the hills before it rises, seemed to fall about their feet. Now, when Sean and I first came across this verse in Season 3 of the Prancing Pony podcast back in, I think, November of 2019, he made an observation that I think is worth repeating here. He noted that in all three of Tolkien's finished works, the elves first appear in the third chapter. And in all three cases, we get a description of the stars and the sound of their singing before we see them or hear their words. Now, I didn't read the star description here. It was just a few paragraphs back when we see that the stars were thick in the dim sky, but there was no moon. Now, in The Hobbit, it's the third chapter, A Short Rest, when Bilbo is riding into Rivendell, noting the famous elf smell, when we read, he looked up at the stars. They were burning bright and blue. Just then there came a burst of song like laughter in the trees, which of course ends up being the tra-la-la-lally down here in the valley. And finally, of the coming of the elves and the captivity of Melkor is chapter 3 of the Quentus Silmarillion. And there, Varda creates new stars and brighter, hence Tintale, like we talked about yesterday. And there's a lovely description of some planets and constellations, followed by Orome riding into the east, where he suddenly stops because it seemed to him that in the quiet of the land under the stars, he heard afar off many voices singing. And that is how he finds the elves at Cuiviénen. Anyway, it's just a really cool thing to observe. I know the third chapter doesn't mean anything, but it was interesting. As for the song, much of what we see is directly related to Varda and her names. Those are all elements that we talked about in yesterday's Word Nerd Wednesday. But there are a couple of other things I want to talk about. The line, amid the world of woven trees, is how Frodo hears it. But in the original Sindarin, it's O Galadhrem en Enrath, which Tolkien translates in The Road Goes Ever On as meaning tree-tangled middlelands, which works, and I actually like it a lot better. Then there's the mention of In the Sunless Year. That song is referencing a time before the sun and moon were created. And that's when Varda kindled the stars in the sky. What a beautiful way of describing that. In windy fields now bright and clear, we see your silver blossom blown. I would have liked to have read more, but this is supposed to be a focus on the songs and poetry, so I didn't. Still, I promised you yesterday that I would talk about Gildor today. So, After Frodo asks who the elves' lord is, we read, "I am Gildor," answered the leader, the elf who had first hailed him. "Gildor Inglorian of the house of Finrod. We are exiles, and most of our kindred have long ago departed, and we too are now only tarrying here a while, ere we return over the great sea. But some of our kinsfolk dwell still in peace in Rivendell." Now, two things here that I want to mention. The first is the lineage of Gildor, as I promised. When The Lord of the Rings was originally published, Finrod was actually the name of Finwë's third son, and he had a son named Inglor Felagund. Now later, Tolkien turned that Finrod into Finarfin and turned Inglor Felagund into Finrod Felagund. So in those earliest editions, Galadriel is described in the appendices as sister of Felagund, but in later editions as sister of Finrod Felagund. There's no mention at all of Gildor in the Silmarillion, and Finrod Felagund never married, so we're left to speculate about Gildor's actual connection with the House of Finrod. The other cool bit here, though, this is amazing, is what the elves were doing, where they were coming from. If we go back to The Road Goes Ever On that we looked at extensively yesterday, Tolkien writes, "The elves in Rivendell could only be said to gaze afar towards Elbereth and Valinor in yearning. But actually, the form used in the hymn," and here he's talking about the Sindarin version of the hymn that's sung in Rivendell, "is Palandiriel, past participle, having gazed afar. This is a reference, Tolkien says, to the Palantir upon the Tower Hills. The high elves, such as did not dwell in or near the havens, journeyed to the Tower Hills at intervals to look afar at Eressëa, the Elvish Isle, and the shores of Valinor, close to which it lay. The hymn is one appropriate to elves who have just returned from such a pilgrimage." But wait, there's more. Tolkien adds, "No doubt Gildor and his companions, since they appear to have been going eastward, were elves living in or near Rivendell, returning from the Palantir of the Tower Hills. On such visits they were sometimes rewarded by a vision, clear but remote, of Elbereth as a majestic figure, shining white, standing upon the mountain Oilosse. It was then that she was also addressed by the title Fanuilos, which is translated as Snow White." And that brings us full circle with yesterday's Word Nerd Wednesday. Folks, thank you for joining me for this week's Third Age Thursday. We'll continue looking at the poetry in The Lord of the Rings for the rest of Series 7, with a return to Hobbit tunes again next week. Check out patreon.com/Tolkien Times to learn how you can support the show, get an ad-free feed, and join my Content Council. And join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times to see who we're talking to on Fandom Friday. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Please follow or subscribe in your podcast apps, and follow @Tolkien Times on all your social media. And finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.